So anyway, thanks for coming. I'm Baron Soka, TechFreedom. So here we are 5 years later, and Rob McDowell is here to kick things off and tell us about his first crack at this. So you were on the commission for, what, 6 years?
7.
7. And here we are again.
Here we are again, Groundhog Day, except a little different this time, yeah.
Right. So Mark said that, first time tragedy, second time farce, and here we are at the third time. What would you call this?
We could be back to a tragedy, I think. It could be a cycle. This is an unfortunate day. I think everyone's familiar with my views. A couple quick things, which is, number one, the FCC went far beyond what the president said he wanted to do, even on November the 10th. So not only is its independence questioned by what it did yesterday, but the vehemence, the overkill with which it executed its actions is really quite astonishing. Now, we don't have an order to read yet, so we'll have to caveat all remarks given that, but just based on the statements and the memo the chairman put out a couple weeks ago, we know that they went much further than they said they needed to originally. So all talk of light touch, I hope that mask is now revealed. I hope that is revealed as a farce and just completely disingenuous.
So big picture, just looking back on all this, where do you think this went off the rails?
At the very beginning. Was it ever on the rails, I think is the question. It was a runaway train that was never on the rails. So, first of all, I think the other side, and I'm trying to look at this as objectively as I can, which is difficult, but the other side did a masterful job of messaging here. They had to create the sense of a crisis, and then say the internet is so horribly broken that only the government can fix it. And then on top of that, say that 3 unelected Washington bureaucrats, of which I'm a recovering one, and I have 2 good friends who are those in the room, but they understand their role, those 3 unelected Washington bureaucrats are better able to resolve all of the challenges of the internet and manage its growth better than entrepreneurs and engineers and consumers. And we need more than just existing law, and that something is wrong with this marketplace when it's not. The American internet ecosphere is the greatest deregulatory success story of all time, and for this to all be turned on its ear to have one of the most massive government interventions into a world-leading economic sector that is improving the human condition unlike anything else in human history is really a shame.
But when you were fighting this fight, it was about net neutrality, and now it's about Title II. Was there a bait and switch here?
There was a big bait and switch. So first of all, keep in mind, history is important, and Baron, you're a terrific student of history. So remember, back in the day, 10 years ago or so, this was advertised as making sure that internet service providers, like your cable company or phone company, could not block content or degrade the content or somehow act in an anti-competitive way that harmed consumers. Right? It was a last-mile focused thing. And by the way, that wasn't happening. The government never did a market study, which I called for back in 2008 during the Comcast BitTorrent matter. And there are already laws on the books that exist that would make that illegal. So it wasn't happening. It wasn't happening because of market forces and because of existing law that existed prior to yesterday. So it has evolved now to be the term net neutrality, beautifully focus group tested, is an empty vessel into which anyone can pour their hopes and dreams of the government regulating their rival, but not them. And that's what many requests boil down to at the FCC and other agencies. Please regulate my rival, but not me. Baron's running too fast. Could you please slow him down? I don't want him to be able to compete with me. And I think that the point that for all these years, net neutrality purists have rejected the notion of a bona fide peer-reviewed market study shows that there is a fear of what that might reveal. The last time anything even like that was attempted was in 2007, granted a long time ago, but by the Federal Trade Commission, which in a unanimous bipartisan vote said there was nothing broken in the internet access market that needed fixing and warned against the unintended consequences of new rules in this space. And it was actually prescient, but here we are today nonetheless.
You mentioned Comcast BitTorrent, and you said that could have been addressed by existing laws. Do you think things might have turned out differently if the Federal Trade Commission had gotten involved and looked into whether surreptitious throttling of BitTorrent might have been an unfair trade practice? Might that have set us on a different direction?
Absolutely. I mean, the Federal Trade Commission is very well equipped. 100 years of case law, common law, operates in many highly complex areas of the economy and the tech economy. So whether it's internet search or operating systems of computers and all the rest, and has done a very good job there. And it's enforcement based, right? And you have the due process protections of actually going to court, and actually can operate in a pretty quick manner. One of the arguments against the FTC or consumer protection or antitrust enforcement in this area, one of the faux arguments is that, well, that's too slow. Well, heck, the net neutrality proponents have been trying for a decade to get the FCC involved. You could have done a number of market studies and had the FTC act in many different ways in that time. But you have the due process protections of being in court. At the FCC, you have no due process protections at this point, as we're seeing with a lot of other enforcement matters, which is a topic for a different symposium we can have. But the FCC is fact gatherer, investigator, judge, jury, and executioner all before the companies even know what's happening to them. So yeah, I think the FTC could have done a better job. And by the way, in Comcast BitTorrent, as I said at the time, the FCC never conducted a factual investigation. People were never deposed or put under oath. They never visited the head ends and talked to the regional managers there to find out exactly what was happening and why. But the FCC acted anyway. So it could have been handled under different law, much more flexibly, nimbly. So what's really going on here? Why Title II? I think it's all about economic regulation. This is the capstone, despite all the protestations to the contrary yesterday. And I think the majority of the commission doth protest too much, that they're not, they swear, going to do rate regulation, whether it's implicit or not. Well, we'll see. Access to networks and rate regulation are intertwined. And I think there will be a complaint at some point to say, by some so-called edge provider that will have networks that look a lot like an ISP or a backbone provider, by the way. They'll be saying, look, ISP provider or internet backbone provider is ostensibly providing me access, or saying they are going to allow access to their network, but at a price that we think is way too high, FCC. Do something about it. And the FCC is going to be put in the spot of saying, you know what, we said we weren't going to rate regulate, and we're not regulating, but you're right. That price is too high. So please come back to us with another price. That becomes de facto price cap regulation. And that's going to happen because that is really the folks who are against usage-based pricing or tiered pricing or what I call pricing freedom. Those who are against it, that's what this debate really is all about, and that's where it's ultimately headed.
Okay, so just to wrap up, so where do you want
You have two very important guys waiting over here in the wings, and so, yeah, you two.
Where do you want this debate to go? What do you think is the best case scenario moving forward?
That it gets blown up in the appellate courts to smithereens. But I think there is still, I'm hopeful, bordering on optimism, but not quite there yet, but I am hopeful that there could be a legislative solution here, but the president can't veto it, right? So there's that.
Okay. Well, Rob McDowell, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Sorry for the rush nature of this. So look forward to hearing you.
I now have the honor of introducing the current two commissioners on the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai and Mike O'Reilly, who are joining me here with Jeffrey Manny of the International Center for Law and Economics. So, please.
Sure. Apparently, it's not an honor to introduce me.
Well, as many of you know, Jeff and I are pretty much sick of each other at this point. So to get started here, evidence of a problem. Is there any?
I think there is evidence. The fact that some people think the dress is gold and white, other people think it's black and blue. The government needs to step in to fix this. But no, more seriously, first, thanks to TechFreedom for hosting this forum. It could not be more timely. I think what Commissioner McDowell pointed out is absolutely right, that you would search in vain, not just in this order, which the public isn't being allowed to see, but throughout the FCC's consideration of this issue, that there's never been a systemic analysis of what the problem with the internet is. In this order, as I pointed out yesterday, you see scattered niche examples of Madison River a decade ago degrading certain applications. You see examples of Comcast and BitTorrent from 8 years ago. You see Apple and FaceTime, that controversy, all of which were resolved, mind you, through private sector initiatives. Nonetheless, the agency decides to essentially create digital dysfunction in order to swing the sledgehammer of Title II regulations at it. And so I've been pretty outspoken about the fact that I think net neutrality is a solution that won't work in search of a problem that doesn't exist. And I think that is absolutely where we are today.
So, Commissioner O'Reilly, let me read you a quote. So back in 2007, the FCC tried to revise media ownership rules. They'd been through this once before, and it failed in court. And the FCC went back at it, and a congressional Democrat objected, and he said that there was inadequate data. It was time to put together an independent panel. He objected to the agency moving forward without fully understanding the effects of his decision. And that, of course, was Senator Barack Obama. And yet today, it seems like things are very different.
Well, there's two parts. First and foremost is, and I think that the letter that's been talked about in a number of different forums is, the right to have the document available to the public. And it's something I've been pushing for, my colleagues been pushing for, a number of chairmen on the House and the Senate have pushed for. That day has passed. We should have had this document 3 weeks ago when it was circulated to the commissioners. We should have made that publicly available so people could look at the specifics of the issue, look at what we're actually talking about when the complaints that I raise and my colleague raises going forward. But that wasn't allowed, disappointingly. And it's something that not only applies in this context, but should apply in many other contexts. There's a lot of other forums and I actually make the argument that it should be done for every open meeting. We should make those items that are circulated available publicly for every open meeting. We're hopefully going to have some, I have those conversations continuing at the Commission, and maybe at some point we'll be able to make that happen, but I haven't been successful yet. But to the bigger point, and I think it's to your first question to my colleague, is there a problem? And the answer is yes, there is a problem, and it is the document that we adopted yesterday. That is the big problem in terms of what is going forward. Now, I know that people haven't had an opportunity to read it like we have. I actually had the benefit of reading it on my honeymoon by the beach and by the poolside in Hawaii. So that was a little bit, provide a little bit of comfort. But I made this point that it is a page turner. And in the sense that you don't know what the next page is going to do, because it's 300 plus pages, and you read through it and you're like, oh boy, what's the next one? What's going to happen next? And then you're looking for justification and rationalization, and of course a lot of that is missing. So I have problems with the content in of itself. And so that's the problem in my view. The bigger question is there a problem that in the net neutrality issue that we're trying to solve? And I think my colleague highlighted it very well. The DC Circuit said it very well. They said it's prophylactic. That's what our rules were intended to be, that there is no underlying problem. This is to go forward. This is something we're trying to guess. As I said yesterday, it's guilt by imagination. We're trying to figure out what bad things might happen in the future, even though it's not happening in the marketplace today. So,
has anything changed since the 2010 order, or since the evidence amassed, such as it is, evidence that Ajit, you recently described as picayune and stale examples that aren't enough to tell a coherent story about net neutrality? Anything changed in this order? Have you seen any additional evidence that suggests there's a greater need for some kind of action now?
Well, a tremendous amount has changed. According to the order itself, broadband deployment is better than it ever has been. Investment has gone up tremendously. On the mobile side, there's much more penetration and much greater speed. I mean, ironically enough, the marketplace that the FCC claims is competitive in some areas of the order, nonetheless is declared in others to be uncompetitive for the purpose of justifying these regulations.
Okay.
Well, so last May you proposed, just as Rob was saying earlier, you proposed doing independent studies in the model of what was done in the media ownership proceeding. Those were the very studies, or that was the model that even Barack Obama said, even that wasn't enough. And yet last May the chairman ignored your proposal. So what would you have wanted?
I've gotten used to that, I think. No, I think that part of the reason why I proposed it, and I think part of the reason I dare say why Commissioner McDowell proposed it many years ago, is that an issue has been largely fact-free for the better part of a decade. And it's frankly shocking that reasoned decision-making in an area as important as this has been thrown by the wayside in favor of what I consider to be an ideological agenda. And for those who doubt it's an ideological agenda, I mean, just look at the Democratic National Committee website. Hooray, the FCC, quote, just approved President Obama's plan. I mean, this should not be a political issue. It never has been before. There's been a historic bipartisan consensus dating back to the Clinton administration. Yet now, according to the Wall Street Journal, you had White House aides shortly after a disastrous midterm election casting about for an issue that they thought would, according to the Journal, build the president's legacy. To me, it seems like the internet should be governed by engineers and by innovators, not by lawyers, bureaucrats, and politicians.
So what would you say is an appropriate response, if any, and also not necessarily only by the FCC, to, again, quoting you from yesterday, the order giving it the most charitable interpretation as possible, I think, it's very kind of you, says that ISPs hold all the tools necessary to deceive consumers, degrade content, or disfavor the content they don't like. Right, and assuming that there aren't any additional examples of actual conduct that's been problematic, that really is sort of the sum total of the problem. All right, well, so if we agree that that's the problem, what would you do about it?
So let us concede for the sake of argument that...
Assuming that is a problem.
Right.
Sorry.
But let's concede for the sake of the argument that ISPs have not only the ability to discriminate, but would in fact discriminate in the future.
Right.
It seems to me that nonetheless, to the extent there isn't a current problem, preemptive regulation by the FCC is not the way to go. There is obviously many tools from antitrust that are available to strike at anti-competitive conduct by players with market power who are behaving in ways that harm the consumer. Ironically enough, though, the FCC's decision yesterday strips one of our major agencies of that tool, and that's the FTC. Right. Because of the common carrier exemption, as my colleague, my friend and colleague over the FTC, Josh Wright, has pointed out, that is the tool that they need in order to protect consumers. Ironically enough, the FCC sweeps all of those powers aside in order to arrogate to itself the sole determination based on, as Commissioner McDowell pointed out, the whim of 3 unelected bureaucrats at the FCC as to how the internet is going to work.
So, can I just jump in on 2 parts here? You said the earlier question was what has changed since the 2010 item, and the answer in part is the court has ruled that the last item was problematic, except for the transparency rule. So 2 parts got thrown out, and that became became the question of what is our authority under Section 706. An argument I've made, extensively. I don't believe there's any authority under Section 706, but the court ruled otherwise. We'll have to see where that goes in the future. But that was not enough for the radical protesters. They had to have Title II, and I made the point that it's a means to an end. It wasn't about net neutrality anymore. It became about Title II being imposed on all of the internet, and not just the last mile. It's also about every aspect of it, and so that is very problematic. And my point to your second question that you asked my colleague, let's assume that ISPs have this power. Well, you have to break that down, right? That's a very broad assumption, because think of all the small ISPs. They have no power. Mm-hmm. I was in St. Louis earlier this week talking to WISPs, the wireless guys, and they have hundreds of customers, not millions of customers. They have hundreds of customers, if that. I talked to a couple that had 50, 100 customers, and they're stringing together a network to provide the best service they can to their consumers. They have no market power. I actually made the point, if they called up Google and said, we want to block your offering, we're not going to let your product go through to reach our consumers, what are you going to pay us? Google wouldn't even take their call. And so I find this, we have to be very careful, lumping everyone together. There's small cable providers that do not have this power. Instead, the argument had been made, a pretty strong argument, I believe, that there should have been some type of treatment provided to small providers, and the Commission ignored it.
So on this example, I'm really always struck in these debates by the Metro PCS example. Back in 2011, Metro PCS was trying to get urban users to adopt, and they offered them a very inexpensive plan that included unlimited streaming of YouTube. And they were attacked as being the first to commit a major net neutrality violation since Comcast BitTorrent. When what they were really trying to do was give people a free service, partnering with Google to make that technologically possible. What do you draw from that example that radicals will point to a company, T-Mobile, that had no market power but was doing something that wasn't strictly non-neutral?
Well, I'll just answer briefly. I think the message is, how dare they be innovative? How dare they try and differentiate themselves in the marketplace? What it has to be is something that the Commission has defined. This is what the product must look like. It must be at these speeds. It must, have for these features, and anything that provides anything different that tries to figure out how best to operate in the market, what might meet consumer needs, is not acceptable.
I think it's a disturbing portent of what's to come. If you look at the FCC's analysis of this so-called Internet Conduct Standard, which is meant to be a catch-all that sweeps in virtually any kind of Internet-related business practice that is not covered by blocking, throttling, and transparency and paid prioritization, it is pretty clear that the agency has on the chopping block all kinds of innovative service plans like T-Mobile Music Freedom, like Metro PCS's previous service. And the best example of that is what the FCC said yesterday. Just let me read you a response to a question. The press posed a question yesterday. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Internet Conduct Standard? What sorts of activities could it regulate, and what are some examples of how the FCC might use it? This is a quote. We don't really know. Another quote. We don't know where things go next, using this kind of construct of what is reasonable. The FCC will sit there as a referee and be able to throw the flag. Now, is there any better example of the fact that now we're going to have lawyers and bureaucrats making these decisions than that? If you were an entrepreneur trying to make a splash in a marketplace that's already competitive, how are you going to differentiate yourself if you have to build into your equation whether or not regulatory permission is going to be forthcoming from the FCC? Permissionless, according to this anyway, permissionless innovation is a thing of the past.
As former Commissioner McDowell recently said, reasonable is the most litigated word in the English language.
Exactly.
Well, to Ajit's point, it was made yesterday. The question was from the press conference, does an ISP have to get pre-approval of what it's planning to offer, what it's offering today in the marketplace? The answer is they don't have to. That's how the answer. They don't have to. Boy, I'd hate to be in that situation.
Or just to give you another quick example, I mean, something like voice over LTE, everyone agrees it's a fantastic service, but it requires priority coding in order to work properly. By definition, that's what engineers say. It has to have priority coding. Then it follows then, if it has to have priority coding, then other related applications can't. And so is that a net neutrality violation? I don't know whether 3 bureaucrats at the FCC are going to decide it is or it isn't, but I don't think they should have to be able to make that decision.
Oh, and it'd be one thing if it was actually 3 bureaucrats, but we're talking about it being something that's delegated to either the Enforcement Bureau or some other part where we may never get to see it. So, that decision may be made long ago, and maybe, the practice may have been threatened against the company and they'll stop doing it, or they wouldn't have moved forward on it. So that's something we may never rise to our level given the structure of the item.
So this is intentionally naive. I'm not really this naive, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's possible that this is true. There must be some limitations in the order to the scope or the ability to apply the general conduct rule, right? I know I've seen reports that there are 7 factors, I guess, that will inform the decision. That doesn't strike me as much of a limitation, of course. But is there anything else that would rise to the level of limitation? The court in the Verizon case pointed out that 706 had these limitations. I happen to agree with Judge Silberman's dissent that these limitations are no limitation at all. But did they even try to put even that kind of limitation here?
Let me put it this way. The best argument against that point with respect to limitations comes from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, hardly a shill for corporate ISP interests, which submitted an ex parte last week and put a blog post in 2 days before our vote this week, saying that these 7 factors are unbelievably vague. Nobody knows how they're going to be applied. Smaller competitors are going to have to lawyer up, which they don't have the resources to do in order to get a plan approved. Moreover, I would add that what the EFF doesn't know is that this plan says the list of factors is non-exhaustive. There may be any number of other factors the FCC might include. And so I think if you're looking at a regulatory body in Washington applying a totality of the circumstances test, which really doesn't mean anything, it really is the whim of a bureaucrat as to what is reasonable.
I mean, they don't call it a catch-all for nothing.
Yeah, right.
It's intended to catch everybody.
It's not limited, yeah.
I mean, you think I can think of like data roaming, right, where you have a number of factors, and you could argue that some of them are more specific than others, and then the last one is whatever else we feel like at that moment. Right. Put your finger in the air and see where the wind blows.
So is Silicon Valley about to get an ugly wake-up here? I mean, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, back in 2007, 2008, 2009, they warned about the FCC's claims of ancillary jurisdiction, which is the theory the FCC was using at the time. They warned about that being a Trojan horse. And then last year, they seemed to embrace Title II, and now they're having cold feet. Do you think they're going to be really unpleasantly surprised how this develops?
I think we're already seeing evidence that they are unpleasantly surprised. Look at Google's ex parte from last week. All of a sudden, because this document hasn't been public and hasn't been vetted properly, all of a sudden people got wind, wow, the FCC is going to classify something called broadband subscriber access service, essentially arrangements between a service that's provided from ISPs to edge providers. And I really recommend Google's ex parte for you because it demonstrates what happens when an agency which doesn't have expertise in this area opines in the dark. According to Google, there is no such thing as broadband subscriber access service. They called it imaginary. and they said it would have all kinds of second-order effects that would be disastrous for edge providers. Moreover, Google said that it would empower ISPs abroad to engage in what calls some sort of sender pays approach, which would be devastating for the innovative marketplace. Now, but for the fact that Google made its voice heard at the 11th hour, the FCC would have been on the brink of creating this essentially without any public input. And I dare say, and I don't want to speak for Commissioner O'Reilly, but I think there are going to be a number of other things, once they see it, that they're going to be very unhappy with.
Yeah, I think my colleague said this very well. You know, in terms of when you read this document, it's worse than you imagined. And so I think that folks are going to have an opportunity to digest it. I've been making the case to edge providers for years now that they are going to be eventually subsumed into the FCC's authority, and that's extremely problematic. They do not want that. The pushback has been that they feel comfortable. A number of them feel comfortable that that won't happen. But I do not feel comfortable having followed the FCC for so many years and now working at the FCC that eventually I believe it will capture edge providers and all of the activity that they do today. Although the amazing things that they're able to bring forward to the American consumers.
Mike, I think you've actually opined on this before, but isn't that true under 706 as well? Does Title II make that a bigger problem than it would otherwise have been, even under the
code? I think it's problematic under 706, but I think what Title II brings is exactly what my friend, former Commissioner McDowell, highlighted, is all the rate regulation. You could argue that 706 may prevent some of that.
Except it specifies price caps.
No, that's right, depending on the structure. But certainly there's been the presentation that this won't get to rate regulation. I think the previous presentation highlighted how you are going to have to get to rate regulation. When a complaint is filed, how do you resolve it without having some type of consideration of rates and what's being offered in the marketplace? So I think we're going to rate regulation. I think that means that the edge providers are going to be subsumed into that debate, and that is a terrible place to be, in terms of what they can actually bring forward.
I think also the Commission's reliance on 201A is problematic even more than 706 because there the agency is explicitly relying on a statutory provision that gives itself the power to determine essentially how interconnection works. They can specify where and on what terms infrastructure has to be deployed. They can specify through routes. I mean, this is something that's really onerous, and I think that a lot of people are going to be unhappy to see it.
But from the point of view of an edge provider, and obviously there'll be different cases where this will matter more and less. Arguably at least, Title II only applies to a telecommunications service, and a lot of those wouldn't be. 706 doesn't have at least that specific limitation built into it. Again, as the court said, it doesn't let the FCC regulate what it can't otherwise regulate under the Act. So I'm just curious again, and then this may be too hypothetical to answer. To the extent that edge providers in particular might be at risk here, do you see 201A being the sort of primary source of trouble, or is it 706 enough to cause them concern?
I think either could be problematic. I mean, the essential problem, though, is that the FCC is essentially focusing on the ends regardless of the means. So I don't think they particularly care which legal theory they use. I think the danger, though, which I've tried to illustrate in another context, is for edge providers like Netflix. I mean, one could make the argument that, look, open video standards are critical to the functioning of a good consumer experience when it comes to video. And I've said that I don't want the FCC to go down this route, but it's not inconceivable to think that if their argument is made that Netflix has market power in the online video marketplace, and it is deploying encryption selectively to disrupt some of the video traffic from being recognized, could a future FCC decide that that's a violation of this so-called virtual cycle of innovation and investment between edge providers and ISPs? Sure they could.
Sure.
There's no principal distinction between the two.
Yeah.
Well, but the chairman kept saying yesterday he did a rigorous analysis. Where's the rigor?
Did he use the word rigor? Really?
He did, several times.
Well, can I just answer the first question, in that there's this belief that it's now Title II and that 706 has been set aside. The truth of the matter is you get both.
Right.
And the full panoply of both. So it's not one or the other. You get both layered on top of each other. And then you get an opportunity to see how far Title II and specifically 201A goes and where they envision it. You actually don't need the rest of Title II based on the views of of where this commission wants to go, because you have 201. 201 does everything. I made the argument yesterday, you really need 151 and 201, and you don't need the rest of the provisions. Congress was wasting its time by including the language. We didn't really need to do the 96 Act, because you had 201, you could have done anything you want. In fact, I'm not even sure why you need, any other provision in Title III. You just assume everybody into telecommunications service.
Sure. Which is odd, by the way, because as we know, mobile broadband doesn't exist. The FCC having determined last month that 25 megabits per second is the standard. So by definition,
That's right.
4G LTE subscribers, you are in the slow lane.
We'll get to that, but is that what you mean, Commissioner O'Reilly, when you talk about forbearance?
Sure. So the interesting thing, and I don't want to get too specific here, but when you have an opportunity to digest the document, the argument has been presented that forbearance is used extensively, so only certain portions of Title II are applied here. Well, truth be told, 56% on my analysis, is actually being forborne from in an optical sense of the word. So 44% still applies. But it doesn't even matter, because that 56 that's actually being forborne is actually forbearance, in the sense that the provisions are subsumed into 201. So if those provisions, 251, we don't need 251 because you can do it in 201. So the original, earlier language had provided specificity on how clear that all that can be covered by the other provisions. You only need a couple core provisions, and they'll cover every problem that doesn't exist today, but that may be seen in the future.
In addition to that, it's remarkable how many times the document uses the classic Washington caveats of for now and at this time. We decide to forbear for now from this provision. We think at this time enforcement of this provision isn't necessary. I think what we've seen over the past year is that a lot of these promises of regulatory restraint are pretty ephemeral, and they change based on not on the facts that are in the record, but on the political vicissitudes of the day.
So just to summarize, just to be clear here, what I'm hearing Commissioner O'Reilly say is they're not forbearing from the really important parts, and the things that they are not forbearing from, you're saying they're just promising not to use those in very aggressive ways today. So what are they giving up, if anything?
Well, I would argue that they're promising to be a little bit more specific. They're promising not to use a specific provision over here that they're forbearing from. They're just going to use 201 to do its dirty work.
So then, what do you say to the chairman when he repeatedly insists, well, forbearance worked just fine for wireless voice?
First, as a factual matter, I think that if one looks at the trajectory of spending by the wireless industry, it clearly was driven by the explosion in mobile data use, starting with the introduction of the smartphone in 2007. I think it's absurd on its face to argue that, because mobile voice was classified as Title II, that the wireless industry has thrived.
And that distinction matters because mobile is not a Title II, was not a Title II.
Mobile voice, correct. Right, exactly.
Mobile data.
Mobile data.
Oh, sorry, mobile data heretofore was not, right. Secondly, as I noted, it's an irony since, as we know, as I pointed out, there's no such thing as mobile broadband according to the FCC last month. But additionally, I think there's a problem with respect to forbearance that a lot of people just assume that reasonable, well, actually, I'll just leave it at that and let my...
Well, I would concur with that. I certainly believe what the problem in terms of our definitions, but what you start to see in mobile data, I think the statute's very clear, and I think that as I said yesterday, I think they're trying to find a way, they define their way out of the issue and try to subsume it within and treat it the same, knowing that full well that mobile has so many different components that make it so different than a fixed broadband offering.
So I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but we haven't covered any broadband and just a few more process questions to wrap up. So Senator Obama, back in 2007, also talked about the need for the public to see the order, and he said that it was not enough for the FCC to make the decision itself. It had to give the public a chance to see it, give Congress a chance to react. Why do you think that they wouldn't do what Kevin Martin, chairman at the time, did when Senator Obama said those things? He put the order out, that time as media ownership. He put that out for another round of public comment. Got another 30 days, avoided any concerns about legal challenges, about not having properly noticed the final rules.
Delayed the vote, right?
Yeah, he delayed the vote.
Yeah.
Delayed the vote, put out a new NPRM. Why didn't the commission do that this time?
Well, it's been publicly reported that the agency was struggling with the question, should we put these new proposals with respect to Title II on the table? The president, having instructed the FCC to implement his plan, which would never had heretofore been on the table, the agency was worried from an Administrative Procedure Act perspective. The public hasn't been given sufficient notice. Ultimately, they decided not to seek further comment. And why? I think because they were being beaten up by the same groups that had successfully, according to the Journal, blindsided the chairman and persuaded the White House to weigh in on Title II. And those same groups were saying, we do not want to delay. A delay is not necessary. There's a crisis to solve now. Solve it. Do what the president said.
So you'd say there is a reasonable question whether the NPRM notices the Title II solution sufficiently?
I think there's a significant
Yes.
APA issue. Absolutely.
But surely the groups that have been pushing the FCC, what they really care about is having legally sustainable rules in place. And it couldn't possibly be the case that they might actually benefit if the FCC loses in court and this fight starts all over again and they get to raise money all over again on this issue. Because that would be ridiculous, right?
To quote Emperor Palpatine, young fool, only now at the end do you understand.
No, but I think my colleague has framed it well. A number of the groups,
You're going to have a hard time beating that one.
a number of the groups had an artificial deadline in their head, and you saw this in our previous meeting. We were having protesters unrelated to net neutrality in previous meetings saying, what are you delaying for? What's the delay? Why? So I think that the pressure on getting something done was more important to have an artificial deadline in February rather than waiting till, could it wait 30 days till March until, you would, as you said, you could build a more stronger document? I think that the groups had said, we're going to do this now and it has to be done now. And then, again, if it goes down, they'll spend years and years looking for it, fighting, raising money, and advocating for it again.
Well, I want to turn to muni broadband, but just one more question on all this. The chairman, when he announced the fact sheet before the order, he made a big deal about tailoring and modernizing the Communications Act. Is that the FCC's job?
No. It has no right to do that. And two, I think the fact sheet, in my opinion, is very misleading, and I've said as such. I think it's very problematic in terms of what was on that document and what you're going to see eventually in the final document.
My colleague put it well. I will simply add that you cannot have it both ways. You cannot preen that these are the strongest rules ever adopted by the FCC, even stronger than what President Obama wanted, and then claim that you're modernizing communications regulation. This is light touch Title II regulation. The ISPs aren't going to see a dime's decrease in end user revenue. Which is it? You have to choose which way it's going to go. And I'm confident, based on what I've read, and I know my colleague feels the same, that once the public sees how far reaching this document is, they'll realize that this is anything other than modernizing Title II.
Well, and it's a point my colleague and I have made a number of times. You're going to see additional costs. The rates are going to go up because of this item. You're going to see universal service decisions made in the coming. It defers the issue, as highlighted in the fact sheet. It defers the question of whether broadband should be subsumed into universal service funding, and that is going to be a matter that we're going to deal with in the coming months. And all of a sudden, boom, consumers are going to see higher rates because of it.
But the FCC's defenders insist that it's only $11 billion in new taxes, not 14 or 15. What's wrong with that?
Well, to that struggling family that's trying to figure out whether they keep broadband, in their household, whether they, try and figure out all the different things that are happening given the, the difficult economy that they're facing, that matters. Every couple dollars matters to a consumer. We know that to be the true in terms of adoption rates.
I'll just say that every single time one of these issues arises, we are told in the minority, look, it's only the cost of a cup of coffee. Oh, it's just, a little saucer full of tea. Well, eventually you're at Johnny Walker Blue and you realize, my God, this is ridiculous for the American consumer. I mean, no one's complaining that their broadband bill is too low, but that's exactly what the FCC is going to feed into, not just because of universal service, but all these second-order effects.
That's right.
Reclassifying broadband providers as telecom services exposes them to dramatically higher state property taxes in a lot of places. The District of Columbia, for example, has an 11% general receipts tax on telecommunications providers and none on other information service providers. That's a direct 11% tax on your profits that will be passed on to the consumer. And there's zero recognition of that in this order.
Okay, so you both have mentioned a few times the 706B report. The FCC redefined broadband to mean only 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. Well, what was wrong with that report?
Do you want to start?
That's too fast
We
softball.
do
I'll leave
have
that
to
to
end
you.
in
Well,
10
no, I mean,
minutes,
it's an extensive report. Let's just start first and foremost how it's so important that mobile be subsumed into our broadband regulations we adopted yesterday, but mobile does not count it at all for that purpose. Right. It's exempt. It's basically said we don't have enough data for that purpose over here, and oh, by the way, it wouldn't meet it anyway. It wouldn't meet the tests that we have. I've argued, extensively that the new standard is done for one reason, and that is to make sure that the Commission reserves its authority to try to use to impose obligations under 706. It's not about the standard itself. I've been talking to a number of different small WISPs, I said, and small cable providers, and talked to somebody who said, I've tried to build my network out. I went to 10.1 because I know that's where the Commission was going, and I actually got ahead of the game, and I went to 20 meg. And I was trying to be ahead and look forward, and all of a sudden, the Commission's determined that I don't have that I'm not actually qualifying, and now I've got to deal with that problem, and not only because I have consumers who are saying, hey, I don't really have broadband, you must increase your speeds. Well, that's not the purpose of the report itself, but that's problematic for his business going forward.
I'll simply add that this administration has taken a cool hand Luke approach to the broadband marketplace. What we have here is a failure to communicate, and we've seen consistently that they raise the bar sufficiently so that they can say that the marketplace isn't competitive, that we aren't making the progress. And the proof in the pudding is when we actually have to adopt rulemakings involving real concrete issues of broadband deployment. For example, updating the Universal Service Fund in December. There, we targeted 10 megabits per second as the standard, and we said, okay, we're going to spend up to $10 billion over the next decade to make sure that broadband is deployed. Well, based on the 25 megabit per standard, the megabit per second standard we just adopted, why are we wasting all that money on something that isn't broadband?
So then what's the point of this exercise? Is it really about justifying more power grabs like muni broadband preemption?
I think that's part of it, and part of it is just a great headline.
I think we better look for questions and
well,
skip muni
we
broadband.
haven't hit muni broadband, so one final question, then we'll take questions from the audience.
And yet we should take questions from the audience.
Okay, muni broadband preemption. What's
Don't
so bad
answer
about
him.
that?
Let's go to the audience. No, okay.
The Constitution and the laws of the United States.
Okay, well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
I mean, look, I made it pretty clear, and you can see in my dissent that I think that under Nixon v. Missouri Municipal League, under Gregory v. Ashcroft, it's pretty clear that the FCC fails the clear statement rule here. If the Supreme Court said that Section 253 wasn't a sufficiently clear enough statement for Congress to be determined to have given the FCC preemptive authority, I don't see how Section 706 possibly could.
I couldn't agree more. I actually have problems with and articulated my views on muni broadband in and of itself. But if you actually look and do analysis of the different provisions that states have enacted over the years to make sure that ratepayers and taxpayers are not fleeced, and these new monorails that many that are being built in many locations, and we've had a number of them fail. And that's you look at the list of the activities that states have imposed, and most of them make complete sense. If referendum, you have to have they actually have to have a business plan. Oh my goodness, we actually preempted the requirement that a state actually said they should have a business plan. Can you imagine that they would go forward without a business plan? So there's so many different requirements that make a lot of sense in the muni broadband world. But our ruling, and you'll have opportunity to see that at some point, highlights that anything less than a flat ban the Commission can preempt, and that's extremely problematic because what we're doing is we're driving states to enact total bans on muni broadband, which if that's where they want to go, then that's where the states will go.
Okay. Before you ask your question, we have very limited time with the commissioners. I'd like to get as many questions as possible, so I'm going to cut
This
you
can be a
off after
one-word
15
answer.
seconds of a question.
My name is Daniel Berninger. I'm a longtime telecom entrepreneur, and so my question, I'm going to read the whole 317 pages or whatever, and I'm going to find in there where my next startup is going to be clearly not regulated. In other words, so I've started 6-7 companies to this point, and the first thing you look for is find out where you are oriented versus traditional regulation. So can you give me some advice? Am I going to find that in there as to where my next startup should be?
I have the perfect answer for you. The order explicitly exempts coffee shops that provide internet service access.
Today
Today anyway, yes, for now.
At this time.
Yeah.
if you're looking for a lucrative business, you should be a telecom lawyer, in terms of litigating this out.
That was Rob McDowell cheering in the audience.
No, but I think that's part of the problem, that the sweep of this order is so vast that it's hard to say, with all candor, where you would find such an opportunity.
Phil Kerpen.
I want to ask about this fake 4 million number, which I find so personally offensive, having organized over 800,000 comments that expressly oppose Title II, the existence of which is not only ignored, but the opposite sentiment is constantly attributed to those people, which is really quite offensive to me and all the rest of the people who said we oppose this, including most of the people in this room. The actual data release from the commission had 2.5 million comments. They claimed that there were another 1.4 million that nobody ever saw, so they claimed there were 3.9. We know at least 100,000 came from abroad. I don't think those should count. And then suddenly it was 4 million plus, when they had only claimed 3.9. So we've got a guy who wants to regulate the internet who thinks 3.9 is greater than 4. Why are they getting away with this? Why is it being reported this way? Why is this claim being given any purchase?
The claim that all 4 million.
Sure. Well, and I've made this. I've raised that point as well. At least 1 million, 1.5 million were on the opposite side. So at best, it's 2.5 to 1.5. But it's been assumed. You know, we saw this in all the statements yesterday and all the press releases in the last couple months that 4 million people have weighed in. A good portion of them do not like any direction, any activity. And I'm still getting those emails today. People are sending me, please don't do this. This is wrong. It's the wrong direction.
In the reply comment round,
Phil,
we're
please,
sorry,
we're going to have to.
Sorry.
Please.
One final question.
Matt.
Anyone?
So it's probably it's Matt Starr from Tech America. So it's probably a fool's errand to play a game of what ifs, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm curious, when this all started a year ago, the chairman initially proposed rules under 706. I'm curious, do you guys think if you had supported those rules then, the rules under 706, if this would have played out differently and we would have ended up where we did now?
If you believe that net neutrality activists who've been working for the better part of a decade would have been placated by Republican support for what they consider to be weak-kneed, gutless, according to them, net neutrality regulations, then I've got a bridge to sell you.
But I would answer it this way. If you think that Ajit and I can support something that will be, where the majority will stay, as opposed to where the administration is going to weigh in on Title II, do you think that we can hold that day? Boy, that's a different commission than I know.
Okay, well, Commissioner has to, both of them have to take off, but please join me in thanking them.
Thanks, guys.
Good to see you, as always. We're going to have a short break here while people please help yourselves to lunch, and we'll get started shortly after noon with our panel discussion.
No problem.
Right.
Of course.